Hello. In this presentation, we're going to look at conscientious objection in a very different political and cultural framework than the one that we have already seen, that was the 1950s. We analyzed their the very first Israeli conscientious objectors. They were total conscientious objectors. And what we're going to see from now on, with the exception of the last group that we're going to be analyzing in a later set of slides, all the groups that we're going to see from now on are not total conscientious objectors, but selective refusers. Peretz Kidron, who's one of the founder of this association called Yesh, Gvul, which translates as there is a border or there is a limit. Gvul has the two meanings. So Peretz Kidron actually claims that the contribution of the Israeli anti-occupation or conscientious objectors movement to peace theory is actually in the creation of the category of selective refusers. Selective refusal is clearly very different from total conscientious objection. And what is important to note is that associations of conscientious objectors that are established from the 1980s onwards are very often associations of soldiers and are made and are launched very often by officers. And selective refusal is somehow, it suits the Israeli situation in the sense that very few are those that claim that no army is needed in Israel. However, many members of this association proudly state and adhere to the idea that there is no need for an army of occupation. Selective refusal really stresses the right and duty of every soldier to scrutinize, therefore evaluate the orders that she or he receives and reject those orders that the soldier, whether he or she, finds morally or politically repugnant. The precedent for this, for the introduction, if you want, of selective refusal in Israel stands in a sentence that the High Court of Justice pronounced in 1956 when a group of soldiers was in the Arab village of Kfar Qasem killed a number of Palestinians, of Arab Palestinian workers coming back from works in the field, because in the meantime a curfew had been imposed, which the Palestinians did not know about. And when tried for having decimated the Palestinian village, some of them responded with the refrain, I was being part of the chain of command, I was just obeying orders. And to that kind of approach, a sentence of the High Court of Justice of the Supreme Court stated that a soldier has the duty to refuse a military order if considered patently illegal. Now, this is if you want, the basic legal background that was established already in 1956, and that in the 1980s was taken up by a number of selective conscientious objectors. And that occurred at a time when the Israeli Defense Forces was used, not for the first time, but in a very open and patent way, as an offensive army with the invasion of Lebanon in 1982. From then onwards, if the first refusers were those who either protested the invasion of Lebanon or refused to go or went and then started to protest when they came back. So from Lebanon, the focus started to shift to the occupied territories. Remember, where in the 1980s the Palestinian protest is somehow mounting, and at the end of the decade we will see the first intifada. So let me go to the first set of testimonies of some Israeli soldiers, which have been collected by Irit Gal and Ilana Hammerman in a book which exists only in French. I couldn't find it in English or in other European languages, entitled De Beyrouth à Jenin, témoignages des soldats israéliens sur la guerre du Liban. From Beirut to Jenin, testimonies of Israeli soldiers on the Lebanon war. Paris 2003, it's very interesting that the title From Beirut to Jenin, meaning from a war of choice, a war of invasion in 1982, to Jenin, which is one of the theaters of the clashes and of the oppression of Palestinians, especially during the Second Intifada, as well as one of the theaters of Operation Defensive Shield, which saw the Israeli army re-entering the refugee camp of Jenin in 2002. Now, the testimonies that we can read in this book, and that I will very briefly translate for you, are very, very interesting, and they they show the difficulty of a generation to understand and justify the reason for this war, for their being involved in this war, which was a war that was fought, for example, through urban centers and in the middle of a civilian population. And this calls to my mind the images of the movie Lebanon of 2009, which I have listed in your filmography, which also portrays the entrance of the Israeli army, in this particular case of an Israeli tank, into very populated areas and populated with civilians. So even more so, the feeling of being out of place and of not wanting to take part to the such a war not considered necessary for the defense and the survival of Israel became even stronger after the massacres of Sabra and Shatila and the refugee camps, about which of course another movie has been made from an Israeli perspective, which is the very famous Wolves with Bashir of 2007 or 8, but it's listed in your filmography again. So let me read you a couple of words from the testimony of a couple of soldiers. The first one that I will be reading, is at page 38 of this book, De Beyrouth à Jenin, and it's the testimony of Uri Schwarzman. And Schwarzman recalls his entry into the city of Tyre, and he said, and I'm quoting, I'm actually translating from French, so bear with me if it takes me a while. My first shock happened when we entered the city of Tyre. Nothing prepares you to enter a city which has been bombarded and full of civilians. The planes and the navy had bombarded the city before we entered, and when when we entered, the city was burning. And in Tyre, for the first time in my life, I understood how you could use an army for the worst, because there were some soldiers, some good men, people that were good in other environments, people that in a civilian life wouldn't harm anybody, nor would they offend anyone. And then all of a sudden, they would take part to a military operation that implied the destruction of a whole town, and they would accept it, and they would accept it without saying a word. And I remember the silence that was reigning in the middle of this folly. The testimony goes on and on with the experience of the same experience in Sidon, and the entrance a few months later in Beirut, and the dissonance between being a soldier, allegedly told that you are there to fight or to protect a Christian minority, and that Christian minority exiting the casino dressed in black tie and long suits, considering the very same soldiers as mercenaries, which is part of this memory that I will not translate for you, but just summarize. But what is interesting, the testimony goes on, and we have 5 months later the demobilization, the discharging of our soldier, that discharge and study an enrollment at university to study medicine. And then the testimony, and I'll start to translate again. One evening, Roy Barnea, a friend, called me. He had also served in Lebanon, and he had fought with the Brigade Golani at the Battle of Beaufort. And we discussed a little bit, and we decided to do something about this. And in March 1983, we installed ourselves on the pavement in front of the house of the Prime Minister Menachem Begin, and we had a blackboard where we wrote down the names of the victims of this war. And I remember that the police, the frontier police, wanted to kick us out from the pavement. And then he continues, I remained for 6 months planted, embedded in front of the house of the Prime Minister. Slowly, other people joined us, and the whole thing changed from a small demonstration into a strike. And every time that a soldier would die in Lebanon, we would update our blackboard. The reservists that were coming back from Lebanon were coming directly to meet us, and they would return their equipment, and then they would come and manifest with us. There would be also some parents who had lost their children who would join us, and more we received some testimonies of sympathy from the population. So what you see is a movement that starts from people who realize that the reasons why they have been sent to war are not really the reasons they were told about, and a movement that starts spontaneously from below, which is a movement of protest that slowly however, gains ground. You have here a picture, the logo of the association Yesh, Gvul, but also a picture of the first demonstration. I should mention here for sure the name of Peretz Kidron. Of Peretz Kidron, you have a book listed in the reference list, which is called Refusniks, Israel's Soldiers of Conscience, published in 2004, as well as an interview that he gave to an American web radio, which is very, very interesting, and in which he explains the establishment of the movement, how it worked, who participated, and what were his personal motivations for starting this organization, which at the time was really more of a sort of a mutual assistance and solidarity organization, a coordinating network. At the time, refusal was very, very uncommon, and the fear was of course, there were fears of being jailed, there was fear of being condemned publicly, ostracism from friends and family. And so the movement really never advocated a direct refusal, which would have brought like criminal charges of incitement, but it coordinated and helped refusers know about one another, so that a movement could start. And in fact, refusers of Yesh Gvul managed to obtain to be heard and to be appreciated even by some public opinion, because at the same time public opinion was growing disenchanted with the results of the war, more than the results, with the events of how the war was unfolding. Remember that this is the time when, for example, after Sabra and Shatila, Peace Now brings to the squares, let's say 250, 300,000 people, and there's an economical crisis going on in Israel at the same time. So refusing, this movement of refusal also started to gain ground. And if we listen to what the then army commander Moshe Levi had to say, and I'm quoting from Kidron's book, one of the reasons for the army recommending an end to the fighting in central and northern Lebanon was that they said, in the words of the army, refusals were running in the hundreds, and we were afraid they would run into the thousands and tens of thousands. So this is the quote from the army, from Moshe Levi. But it's interesting that in Yesh Gvul at the time, nobody suspected that the army was fearing refusals in the thousands or in the tens of thousands. What they knew, Kidron says, they knew of the 168 people who went to prisons, but nobody knew of the unhappiness and of the discontent and disillusionment that was that had filtered through in the army. So the question is, how many so-called grey refuseniks exist per every open refusenik? A grey refusenik is someone who does not dare come out publicly with the option of refusal, with the statement of refusal, for fear of condemnation, ostracism, jails, solitude, and so on, abandonment from the family, rejection, and so on. And so the statistics, or the idea, is that per every open refusenik there is something in between 10 to 20 so-called grey refusers. Other organizations were established in 1982, Soldiers Against Silence, the Committee Against the War in Lebanon, Mothers Against Silence, which then became Parents Against Silence, and we will look into this next week when we speak about the involvement of women into peace building. But to go back to Yesh Gvul, there are two more things to say. One is that when the military campaign in Lebanon was called off, then Yesh Gvul somehow fell semi-dormant for a while. But the second thing to say is that it reawoke when, in the mid-1980s, when it shifted its attention to the occupied territories. And I'm going to read a testimony from Peretz Kidron himself. And he said, so why refusal? Well, because certainly you can't fight a war without an army, but the same holds true of an occupation. There is no occupation without an army of occupation, and there is no army of occupation without soldiers. It's as simple as that. If you can convert soldiers to make this whole army of occupation thing insecure and make it controversial, if you can make people think about it, this was the most effective way of campaigning against the occupation. It's a very effective technique because it hits a particularly sensitive place in the power structure, because it hits the army, and it has enormous potential because the army never know where it's going to end. Kidron had been, after all, involved in all kinds of groups and in all kinds of protests, as he himself says, but it was only through Yesh Gvul that he felt he was actually hitting one of the central points or mechanism of the occupation. And that, of course, was clearly the army, because he was saying the general protest against the occupation had, in general, very little effect. Now, Yesh Gvul does not generally work with Palestinians directly. However, Kidron maintains that on the political level, they are enormously important to the Palestinians. And that's because, after all, refusal to serve has aroused a terrific amount of respect on the Palestinian side. The thing is that the network that existed in Yesh Gvul during the Lebanon War, it also continued to exist when Yesh Gvul was protesting and so supporting refusal against serving for the occupation or in the occupied territories. And so, in this sense, it was a structure that it already existed that could better support numbers and increasing numbers of refusers. I will now turn to the various organizations that followed Yesh Gvul, and we will try to see together differences and similarities between them. Thank you very much.